Hey, my name's Pat Millea. So for a few days now, I've been thinking and reflecting a lot about this blessing that Pope Francis just extended to all of us this past Friday in the midst of this coronavirus outbreak. It's a special blessing called an Urbi et Orbi blessing. Urbi means the city, as in the city of Rome, the Pope's diocese. Et Orbi means and the world, the entire church and all of God's children that the Pope is in charge of shepherding, has been given authority over. It was a beautiful moment, and blessings like this happen at least twice a year on Christmas and Easter, but the Pope has the ability to extend blessings like this to the church whenever he feels like it's necessary, and this coronavirus outbreak is the perfect opportunity, obviously. It was really eerie and beautiful and really breathtaking, honestly, because here's Pope Francis in the middle of St. Peter's Square on a gloomy, dreary, rainy night in Rome, and it's completely empty. There's nobody there in all of St. Peter's Square. And anytime that the Pope sets foot near St. Peter's Square, there are thousands and thousands of people hanging on his every word. But that day, it was just him alone, but contained within the world that is the church itself, surrounded by all of the faithful, still hanging on his every word. It was really beautiful. He reflected on the gospel of the calming of the stormy sea, where Jesus calms the storm. When the apostles go to Jesus and say, Lord, don't you care about us? We're dying here. And Jesus says to them, have you no faith? He reflected beautifully on the ways that we've been going about our lives in this world at just a breakneck pace, and assuming that we would always be healthy in a culture and a society and a world, the creation itself, that is sick with our own sinfulness, our own selfishness and self-concern. He reflected beautifully on how Jesus does care for us. He is concerned for us, even when we feel like we're dying, even when people in this world are dying, that Jesus is there with us. He feels that. He's present. Then Pope Francis prayed in front of an image of our Blessed Mother and in front of a miraculous crucifix that was actually part of a miraculous healing of Rome, that in 1522 there was a plague that was threatening to wipe out all of Rome. And they processed this crucifix through the streets of Rome, and the plague was eradicated. So we prayed in front of that crucifix, asking for healing of some kind in our current outbreak. And finally, there was this amazing moment of prayer in front of the Blessed Sacrament before Pope Francis offered benediction, a blessing for the entire world with the monstrance. And in that moment where it was just the Pope and the Eucharist in silence, and all of us watching and praying in our various cities, I couldn't help but think of all the conversations that Jesus had with Peter back 2,000 years ago, St. Peter. Because he had a friendship with Peter, right? I mean, Jesus was fully God, so he was completely and perfectly divine, but he was also fully human, which meant that he had a friendship with Peter, a relationship, and that relationship went through highs and lows. All the conversations they had where Jesus told the disciples and all of his followers that unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. And a lot of people left. They thought he was nuts. So he turned to his apostles and said, are you going to leave too? And Peter, the first pope, said, where would we go, Lord? You have the words of everlasting life. There's nothing out there for us. I think of the first conversation that Jesus had with Peter when he called him and Andrew for the first time and said, come after me and I'll make you fishers of men. And Peter dropped his nets and went after him. I think of the time that Jesus asked Peter, who you say that I am. All those people out there have different ideas about me, but who do you say that I am? And Peter, beautifully, prophetically, said, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus responded and said, not human wisdom has taught you this, but God himself taught you this. And on Peter, on you, on this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will never prevail. And then just a few verses later, he tells Peter that he's going to go die in Jerusalem. And Peter says, no, Lord, don't go. I don't want you to die there. And Jesus says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You're not thinking as human beings do, you're not thinking as God does, but as human beings do. You're not thinking as God does, but as human beings do. All these deep conversations that they had back and forth over 3 years. And then I thought about all the conversations that Jesus and Peter have had since that time. All the conversations that Jesus has had with the successor of Peter, the Pope, throughout generations. Like, what about the time when Christians were being killed, martyred, persecuted constantly for their faith? That the Roman Empire was looking to squash and exterminate the Christian church. What about the time shortly after that that disagreements and divisions within the Christian church, disagreements about who God even is, threatened to destroy the church? What about during the Middle Ages when the church was way too caught up and dragged down by political affiliations and strength, chasing after power and strength? When the church was way too caught up and dragged down with political affiliations and being power hungry? What about during the Renaissance, during this transcendent period of creation and appreciation for the beauty that comes from God? What about in the years following Vatican II up to this day, where there's all kinds of divisions and disagreements about who the church is, about what the church should be, and how we should relate to God through the church? What about more recently in our postmodern era, where we watched one amazing pope retire and another amazing pope step into the throne of Peter? In that moment, in that silent moment a few days ago of Pope Francis spending time with Jesus, I couldn't help but wonder, what's that prayer like? What's that conversation like for them? And what's it been like for 2,000 years? Because here's the thing. Whatever Jesus says to Peter, especially in the Gospels, he's saying to the whole church. And whatever Jesus says to the church, he's saying to you and me. So whatever conversations Jesus and Peter have major ramifications for all of us. It's Jesus saying those things to us out of the love that comes through the church. That's the beauty of those conversations between Jesus and Peter. Now, we'll never know the details, obviously, of what Jesus and the popes are saying to each other, and that's probably a good thing. We don't need to know. What we do need to know is that Jesus is still taking care of us, that our Father in heaven is taking care of us through our Holy Father on earth. That through the ministry of Peter, that rock that Jesus gave his church to, that we are still being cared for, that we're still being shepherded, that we're still wrapped up in God's arms, that through the ministry of the Pope and our bishops and our priests and the priesthood of the laity and the whole church, that all of us are being drawn closer to God. So thanks be to God that Jesus is having these conversations with Peter over the generations. Thanks be to God that he has conversations with us, that we know that God's caring for us, especially in difficult times like this. Know that I'm praying for you, and take some time to listen to what Jesus has to say to you today as well. Thanks. God bless you.